Okay, welcome. We're going to get started with our session. I think we may have a few more people coming into the room over time, but we're going to get started because we have several presentations we want to convey to everyone. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to a robust discussion. My name is, first of all, your session is, if you're in the right place, is Social Media, Conflict and Peace Building. What insights and lessons do we have from recent practice and research? I'm Will Ferrojaro. I'm the Senior Specialist for Peace and Technology at Mercy Corps, the Humanitarian Development and Peace Building Agency. I'm delighted to facilitate this discussion today on this topic. The topic is the subject of a recent paper we produced, to which my colleagues here and others were key contributors. So just very briefly, I'm joined today by Katja Vogt of IREX, Medinat Malafakis of the Collegium Helveticum in Zurich, Frederick Ogenga of the Peacemaker Corps Foundation Kenya, and Iria Puyosa of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. I'll introduce each of them briefly before their remarks, but that's who you see on the screen, and welcome. We're also being assisted and joined by my Peace and Tech colleague Adrian Brooks, and Aishwarya Jadhav of AFP is behind the scenes making all the magic work. So very briefly, with the discussion paper, which was posted online in the session description, we intended to highlight key achievements, challenges, and trends, as well as gaps and the needs of peace builders focused on social media and conflict. We want to use this session as an opportunity to highlight some of the themes from the paper, but also to take leave of the paper to explore particular issues of concern. We've designed this session as a series of 4 very brief reflections, and with the opportunity for interaction with all of you after each reflection. So first and foremost, please post your questions in the online chat here in this session. And in order to continue this discussion beyond our session, we're providing a forum for comment and input and to facilitate contact going forward. We'll put that in the chat as well. And as a reminder, both for just so you know, and for sharing later on and for viewing later on, the Alliance for Peace Building is recording this session and it will be posted sometime after the conference. So before we begin the series of reflections, a bit of background on the discussion paper and this session. First, the context that violent conflict remains on the rise and that social media is playing an important role. For example, political actors have used social media to target critics with disinformation, while COVID-19 misinformation spread online has spurred hate speech against groups and individuals. Current offline and online approaches and tools to address these challenges seem insufficient to the task. It's kind of a second motivation. Well, peace builders are increasingly addressing these social media harms alongside traditional and non-traditional conflict drivers. It remains a relatively new area of peace building. However, there are lessons to be learned and practices to share from this experience. The paper is organized in several sections under the themes: what we know about the problems of social media and drivers of conflict, which responses have been effective or promising, some questions that remain, and some recommendations for peace building practice, as well as engagement by peace builders with other actors. Among the themes and issues that come forward are a lack of clarity on definitions, a lack of appreciation for the role of digital technologies, positive or negative, in peace building and other sectors, the need for more evidence of effectiveness in the responses that we design and implement, and necessity of holistic approaches, not least across sectors. So with the 4 reflections and your inputs in response in this session, we hope to articulate some of the challenges and problems facing peace builders, explore complexities via a case study, assess what we know and don't know about interventions in online, offline dynamics, and finally, to suggest some key areas of focus and of ways of working going forward. So that's a little bit of a background. Now we'll move to the reflections. Our first reflection looks at some of these challenges and problems I mentioned. Katja Vogt will present on understanding manipulative information and how it works. The key to mitigation of harms and resilience. Katja is the global lead on building resilience to manipulative information at IREX, the international nonprofit. She leads IREX's Learn to Discern, a human-centered systems and behavior approach to enabling healthy and critical media and information engagement, implemented in over 20 countries, working with local organizations and institutions. She previously served as IREX's country director in Ukraine. Katja, take it away.
Thank you, Will. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I will use a presentation for this reflection, mostly as a guidepost to myself to just keep on track as someone who is Ukrainian but is not in Ukraine. I carry a heavy weight of worry and powerlessness right now to be able to do anything. So bear with me in this presentation, and I will reference this role of disinformation in the conflict in Ukraine in my presentation as well. So I will share my slides right now. Please, Will, flag if you do not see it. So at this point, you should see the screen that says manipulative information, understanding how it works. I will just give a very quick background on my organization and the angle that we will take in this reflection. The reflection will focus on the key of understanding the mechanisms and the incentives and the reason why manipulative information works and how it works and why is it a threat, to designing solutions that could have impact, positive impact on changing the influence of manipulative information on decision making. And the outcomes of processes that disinformation is seeking to disrupt. And we come at it through IREX's human-centered lens. We're an organization that has been designing and implementing leadership, capacity building, strengthening programs. So we come at it with an understanding of how human learning, as well as how it intersects with technology and the enabling environment. So I am trying to click through my slides and I am having trouble. Oh, there we go, sorry. So this, the next 3 slides are mostly guiding posts for me to talk about the impact and the threat that we are looking at. It is, and I will right away say that I will use the term manipulative information, and there is a reason for that. Manipulative information includes disinformation. It's incorrect information created with the intent to cause harm. It includes misinformation, also incorrect information that does not have the intent to cause harm, but is wrong for other reasons, and malinformation, perfectly correct information that is intended to cause harm, and everything in between those 3. So manipulative information includes many, many other things that are the focus of which is to manipulate your decision-making, your behavior, and also decision-making and behavior of larger systems and processes in a community or a country or a nation or globally. So it's broader than miss, but if you hear me kind of default to disinformation, it's just because for years we've been talking about disinformation, and now we recognize the threat of manipulative aspect of it. No sector is immune. We'll give some really good examples from the health sector, from the COVID disinformation and others. We see impact throughout our work in governance and communities, in leadership, in integrity of elections, public health, radicalization and extremism globally and domestically, and of course in conflict. And in conflict, manipulative information is used as a weapon. the kind of the dimension of the threat that I want to bring out as I reflect today on what we know about it is that it really spills over everywhere. We in our paper we talk about social media and online harms, but it has a spillover into all types of informational environment, from professional or professional looking traditional media, broadcast media, to word of mouth. And it is because social media has shifted the world of information and how we engage with it. No one just consumes information as a one-way participant in this stream. It's a two-way or a multi-way pathway road. And so that also has been put on steroids. It's cheaper, faster, further, and a higher volume than ever. So keep that in mind as we go forward. And just to kind of reiterate the manipulative information aspect of this, very often we've observed, and there will be a couple of examples that follow here, where there is a tendency, because the problem is so urgent, to come up with a quick response. And so the appeal of solutions that solely rely on identifying lies or disinformation are extremely attractive, because they can give you a way to just take stuff down. It is increasingly impossible, because out of context facts, half-truths, appeals to emotions, biased and ideological narratives cannot be easily identified by AI or any sort of kind of, automatically checking platform. It requires human discernment and contextual knowledge. So that's just something to keep in mind. And now I'll just provide a couple of examples. I'm not going to dwell on them because I'm aware of time. But here's an example from the health sector, where if you look at these stats, it's just staggering how much more viral, to use the health sector analogy, manipulative information or disinformation is than facts-based information. And I will reflect on why and how that happens, but this is just a very kind of visual in your face example of the appeal or the spread and the virality of this type of manipulative information. The second example is from the governance and politics sector, that just shows the global scale of the problem, as well as the type of appeal it has for abuse in the political sphere, around elections, around some sort of narratives that political leaders want to use to increase their power and attack opposition. And this final example is personal. As Ukraine goes through a time of huge uncertainty and potentially devastating consequences, these are just some of the headlines that I've pulled this week in preparation for this session. I know not all of you read and understand Russian, but I just want to highlight that this is a combination of what I'm talking about. There's outright disinformation, there is outright lies, there's also stuff that doesn't necessarily sound like disinformation, yet when you read it and look at it, it provokes a very strong emotional reaction, pushing you into a very, very dangerous territory. So with that, I'm going to come to kind of the meat of my discussion and talk about why does this happen? And this is important because we must understand both the how is it that manipulative information on social media with spillover to all other sorts of information flows is so effective, and also how does it happen? And that is we can't really come up with solutions that will have long-term sustainable consequence or build resilience without really looking at these factors. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. These are just some kind of guiding posts, the statements that I have up there about the nature of the technology that has brought this about without evil intent, as well as our human operational system that makes us vulnerable to disinformation. I'll go through them quickly, but then spend a little bit of time discussing how they feed into that how and the why. First of all, it is not a secret that digital devices are increasingly accessible and addictive. Even in places like Yemen, you can buy a $15, put it yourself together smartphone that will charge during the day and work at night, which is a smartphone, which has become for many people their primarily device for accessing information flows. It is a global trend. It is growing. It's not going away. That's why the paper to such a large degree focuses on social media, because that's where people get their information. They're also addictive. This is a challenge I often ask when we have very interactive, back into the in-person days, but also in interactive sessions. How many people have, since I've started talking, looked at their phones? Probably at least half. I have put mine very, very far, so I'm not distracted by it and I'm not drawn to it. But digital devices are designed, by design, are addictive, and their features like the notifications, the buzz, they have been designed with the same principles as slot machines in gambling institutions, where they provide you frequent, random rewards. There might be something interesting at the other end of this ping. Why don't I just look? It will only take a second. That is what's intended to keep us there. So we are there a lot. We spend a lot of time with information. Secondly, manipulative information is very cheap and profitable, and I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. We filter this information through our emotions and biases, and that is extremely powerful, more powerful than we want to recognize sometimes. Finally, algorithms are morally agnostic. While social media didn't design their algorithms to be evil and prioritize information about bad stuff, they prioritize engagement. And engagement, likes, shares, very often happens with stuff that provokes a small emotional reaction, a strong emotional reactions, feelings of anger, feelings of panic, feelings of disgust, and strong positive feelings as well. But they do keep us there, and they translate into advertising revenue. So that's the whole premise of the business model. And finally, the spillover, that I mentioned at the start. Traditional media, broadcast media, radio, TV, community radio, they have to compete for audience attention and revenues. So the way they operate have shifted in the recent years to look more like social media, to be more attention grabbing, because otherwise they'd be out of audience and out of business. And finally, while access to all of this is very intuitive and easy, you can give a smartphone to a toddler and they'll figure out how to use it within the first 5 minutes of having that in their hands. Skills to discern what's good and what's not are counterintuitive. They actually go against our operational system and how we've been built to react to information. And so they need to be deliberately taught. Let me spend just a tiny bit more time. I'm watching the time. I think I have a couple of more minutes, right? Will, nod, or okay. So I'll just run through the how and the why that I've mentioned earlier, because I think it's important to kind of to spell some of these things out. And then I would really like to have a discussion and hear what questions you have. But as an organization that works in this space on the human resilience side, we have looked at the reasons why and how things happen. And what comes out of it, and I would like to discuss this with all of you, is that organizations currently working on the far forefront of fighting the problem actually do not have the power to change some of these things, as we will see. So let's start with the why. The why is that, simply speaking, manipulative information is extremely cost effective and profitable. The example of the Macedonian teenagers that was all over the news several years ago, where there was this troll farm, basically, is a prime example. These were not malign actors. These were people to make a profit, and they made disinformation because it pays. For the same reason, clickbait is a multi-million-dollar industry. It is extremely profitable. There are middle schoolers in my kids' class who now say they want to be influencers and make clickbait because that's what they see as being extremely profitable. Malign actors sponsor and invest in disinformation because it is cost effective, because for the cost of relatively little investment, you get a huge tool that can advance or shape agendas. And as I already mentioned, algorithms that prioritize emotional chase content does not help. They bring in the advertising and revenues. The other reason why it works is that it hacks our attention. I already mentioned the addictive property of the devices and kind of the attention economy, and the fact that independent and traditional media is losing traditional sources of revenue and forced to compete with easily produced disinformation, which is way more entertaining. The disinformation is always emotionally charged and engaging, and it plays on our biases: confirmation bias, reputation bias, repetition bias, all of these things. So the more you see something, the more likely you'll believe in it. When something comes from your friend or a relation, the more likely you'll believe in it. When something comes from an expert, the more likely you believe in it, because your brain takes a shortcut. Because there is so much information around us, we utilize shortcuts, relying on opinions of our friends or experts, or relying on the fact that if I've seen this enough, this must be true. There are many other biases that play into it, and I could have a whole session on that, but I'm not going to go into it. Finally, we are naive. We overestimate and we have overconfidence in our ability to utilize critical thinking. So we don't really think that we are biased. Most of us think that we're able to disengage, and we don't like to individually admit that we default to these shortcuts. We consume information very quickly. We spend seconds scrolling through headlines and making decisions. And this abundance of information is what it does. It creates a lot of noise that drowns out objective facts and distracts us. So that's kind of the brief outline of the whys. The how is equally important, because some of the disruption can and should happen at the how. The how is that it is extremely easy to make and target. There's cheap human labor in troll factories in Putin's Russia, and in I'm sure in other regions as well. There are also unwitting human producers and contributors, including media and journalists. There's big stories on journalists and starting journalists being tricked into writing stories and false facts, so that disinformation would assume the veneer of legitimacy. There's also AI increasingly generating very convincing content, disinformation content, when fed appropriate parameters. Digital editing tools are very intuitive, and anyone can use them. It's extremely easy to Photoshop a fake. Doesn't need to look like professional journalism anymore. The more authentic, the better. It can look like professional journalism also, because professional journalism is increasingly trying to look like social media posts to stay relevant. And there is a lot of information about us out there. People, when we all engage, including myself, with information online, we share a lot of information about us. So it's extremely easy to target information towards our preferences, which is extremely dangerous when you're talking about someone who is trying to peddle hate speech or seed conflict and division. And social media bubbles make it extremely easy to target polarizing messages.
Katya, let's we have a number of participants in the session. I'd love to hear some of their reactions to your presentation. There's a lot to chew on there. I love the kind of key issue of the challenge of the ease of use of technology, and the distinction between the difficulty of the skills of discernment. So that's a key thing that I picked up. Does anyone want in the chat to put a question forward or a comment? We of course have others to that we can relate. I see a question about sharing slides, so we'll capture. We will definitely capture the comments here. Certainly, I think one question, Katya, that comes to mind is what kinds of organizations, players, entities should be responsible in designing effective solutions and responses to this weaponization of social media. Let me just put that question forward first to the participants, if anyone wants to respond, and then maybe you can respond to their response if they're forthcoming.
That sounds great. And apologies for going over time.
Question in the chat. Is it feasible? We can go with the chat first too. So let's do that. Is it feasible to envision peace building bots producing lots of positive narratives to drown out the negatives?
That's a great question. I think it is very feasible. I think because of all of the incentives that I've discussed in kind of, it kind of could be like an escalation in narratives, which might overwhelm the space. But I think it's definitely worth doing that because we see a lot of engagement with emotionally triggering information, and the most powerful emotions that get people going and sharing are those of fear and anger, because we are programmed to want to share that information to protect our communities. So if we can find equally powerful trigger to share the positive narratives, I think that would work really well. It is just recognizing that emotional appeal of and the targeted nature of that information that the malign actors have been utilized makes it hard.
Let's maybe go to one more question, and then we'll move to our next reflection here. How can peace builders set up mitigation measures around manipulative information? So that's a very broad question. In 20 seconds, Katya, do it.
I think it needs to be a partnerships. I think that my kind of answer to the question of what kind of organizations need to work on this for resilience, my call to action is broader partnerships with organizations that can help address the problem from multiple angles. So better, good content out there needs to happen. Technology tools to quickly disrupt the bad narratives need to happen. Human resilience to build skills to recognize manipulative information and reject it needs to happen. And where possible, with extreme care, working with regulators and policy to create a more productive, enabling environment for fact-based information needs to happen. But it can't happen in isolation and just in peace-building sector. I think it's time for a whole of society approach to solving the problem. And so my invitation here, and I will finish with that and pass the baton off to my co-panelists, is to seek out partnerships with organizations that might be outside of peace building, but who can have impact on this information environment and ecosystem.
Thank you, Katya. That's a great segue because we make mention of this in the paper about holistic approaches and working in multifaceted ways. Okay. Please keep your questions coming. Even if we can't get to all of them, we will capture them, and we will be dropping a form for you to provide further input. Our next reflection will be actually a case study, and Dr. Medinat Malafakis will explore social media profiteers on Nigeria's conflict landscape. Medinat is a conflict and terrorism analyst with expertise on the Boko Haram terrorist insurgency in the Lake Chad Basin of West Africa. She also doubles as a peace-building expert, currently researching the role of digital technologies as conflict catalysts and peace-building tools in Nigeria. Medinat, please.
Thank you very much, Will, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much also for being here with us in this panel. Like Will explained, I will be bringing a case study perspective into this conversation. And to ride on what Katya already explained, I will be giving an example of how manipulative information can be appropriated by different parties in conflict, and how they can then turn this manipulation into weaponization. And the example I'm going to use, of course, is the Boko Haram insurgency in the Lake Chad Basin of West Africa. This is the area that this is the area that borders Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Just a little bit about the insurgency. It began around 2009, around this area that I've mentioned. And it has, from this period up until 2022 now, been an insurgency that has become one of the longest running insurgency in the region. The former leader of the group was also, or has been adjudged as, the longest running leader of any insurgency in the world. And sometime in 2015, the insurgency was termed the most deadliest insurgency in Africa. And this was based on the number of people that it had killed and the rates of internal and external displacement that it had caused. By 2021, I think, Boko Haram's terrorism in the Lake Chad Basin had led to the death of over 45,000 people in the area, had led to the internal displacement of about 1.9 million people who are currently IDPs in Nigeria, and also external displacement of Nigerians to countries in like Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. So, and it's still an ongoing insurgency. To talk about how social media especially has become an avenue where conflict actors can use information as a weapon, I want to break down the Boko Haram conflict landscape into the social media enablers and the social media profiteers. The enablers basically are the telecom companies who make internet accessible to people in Nigeria, and they would actually normally would not be a party to conflict. But the problem is that their role kept on oscillating from being independent internet providers to becoming agents of the government who provide information on Boko Haram's attacks and Boko Haram's activities, which made it possible for the government to go after these people. And then their role then changed to become terrorist targets, because then Boko Haram started to target them when they started to do this. But I'm not going to dwell on their role today. I'm going to focus on the social media profiteers, the people who, via social media, appropriate information and use it as weapons. These profiteers will be divided into three groups. The first is Boko Haram, the group itself. The second is the Nigerian government, and by extension, the Nigerian military. And then the third is the Nigerian citizenry. I'm going to start with the group itself. Very unlike other international terrorist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, Boko Haram does not use social media for recruitment purposes. And the reason they don't do this is because they rely more on face-to-face recruitment. And more importantly, the area where Boko Haram operates has low literacy rates. So it's better for them to do face-to-face recruitment, because the people who they want to recruit do not have access or the capacity to be on social media a lot. And what do they use social media for? The first thing that Boko Haram uses social media for is what we call narrative control. They want to be in charge of the kind of information that they pass around, and they use this in various forms. To start with, when Boko Haram makes an attack, they use social media to show proof that the attack happened. And when I come to how the government use social media, you understand why Boko Haram needs to prove that their attack happened. So when they use this to show that the attack happened, and when they do this, they dress in the normal terrorist regalia with camouflage, with guns, and with bullets thrown around their body. And all of this is to present an outlook of the fact that they are a functional terrorist organization who can or have the capacity to come face to face with the Nigerian military, a military force that has been adjusted as one of the most efficient in Africa. Boko Haram does this to ridicule the Nigerian government and the Nigerian military, basically. They also use social media and the presentation of their information on social media as bargaining chips. If you remember in 2014, when Boko Haram abducted about 300 girls in a secondary school, it was on social media that they put the information, what they call a proof of life video, out to show that the girls were still alive. But they didn't show that the girls were alive because they wanted people to know about it. They did this because they wanted to use this knowledge as a bargaining chip, not just for the Nigerian government, but for the populace and the other people, especially because at the time, this Chibok abduction had become like an international sensation where everybody around the world were concerned about it. So they decided that they would use social media to show this proof of life. When they do these kind of things, like showing evidence that an attack happened or to show proof of life, Boko Haram does not use conventional languages. They concentrate on using Hausa and Kanuri. And this is also a way of weaponizing information, because they do not want people who don't understand this language to have verifiable access to the information. So they kind of, not coded, but restrict the understanding of the information when they pass it across on social media. And this is also another way that they manipulate the people who get this information, and they weaponize the information that they share. Apart from using social media like this, Boko Haram also uses social media to pass information to their overt or covert supporters, or to their cell members who are currently not where they are. So, for example, sometime in 2014, the leader of Boko Haram wanted to change the process, the terrorist process. He wanted to change the way in which terrorist attacks was going to be done. And he posted a YouTube video to tell his followers that right now, don't concentrate on some sophisticated attacks, but wherever you are, take up weapons and kill, kill, kill. Only spare women, only spare children, and only spare the mentally unstable people, but every other person, kill, kill, kill. And what we noticed at this time was that with passing this information across, the sophistication of Boko Haram attacks decreased, but the rate of the attacks increased because people didn't, the people who took up this charge, that this information that was passed off social media, they stopped to, they didn't bother about the finesse of the terrorist activities. Then they just wanted the numbers. They wanted to know that the cause of their leader was heard. And this is how this kind of information is passed. The other important way that Boko Haram uses social media and the kind of information they put out on social media is for propaganda. Most times, they want to show that in their captured territories, what they call the Dawla, areas where they are administering their own version of Islamic law, that everything is working well. So on YouTube or on their Telegram channels or on other social media platforms, they will share videos of life, what they call normal life. You will see women who are wearing hijabs, who are carrying out their normal chores. You would see, for example, the implementation of Sharia law, where people might be beheaded if they commit some atrocity, or some people's hands are cut off. What they think that Islamic implementation of Islamic law should look like in the Dawla, they show this live on social media. And the propaganda they're trying to share at this point is that when you compare life in your Nigeria or in the Lake Chad Basin with what life looks like in our Dawla, you can see that we're living well, everything is fine, everybody is happy. So this outlook of life is going on well in Dawla is a propaganda information that they share a lot on their social media platforms. This continued, it started around maybe 2014, 2015, but it became much more sophisticated in 2015 when a breakout version of Boko Haram became aligned with ISIS. And this was when we saw more sophisticated use of social media by Boko Haram. They made greater use of YouTube and Twitter. They established their own Arabic Twitter account known as Al-Ura Wal-Uthqa in 2015. The quality of the videos that they shared improved tremendously. So we saw that gradually, more increasingly, they appropriated social media and the kind of information that they could pass on social media as a weapon that could be used for different purposes. The second group of people who profit from social media and use the information that they share as a weapon is the Nigerian government, and by extension, the Nigerian military. And I say this because the Nigerian government and the Nigerian military, in the eye of most analysts or even the Nigerian population, they are one and the same thing. They never contradict themselves. They share the same information, even if the information is wrong. Even if there's proof that the Nigerian military's information was wrong, the Nigerian government would rarely come out to contradict whatever the Nigerian military has said. And they also do a lot of narrative control when it comes to use of social media. They also share a lot of propaganda. And the reason is because for a long time, the Nigerian military was, and I think also still remain, one of the first sources of information about Boko Haram's insurgency. They are the people who have first contact with insurgents, with displaced persons, with IDPs, with refugees, with captured members. So even for researchers and analysts, we rely a lot on the first-hand information that we get from the Nigerian military. And they use this to their advantage because they then try to monopolize the information landscape when it comes to Boko Haram. And what they do, or the reason why they do this, is because they want to project this assumption that everything is working well. They are on top of the situation. So most times, the kind of information that the military would share is how they overrun Boko Haram bases, how they were able to capture insurgents, and how, for example, they were able to rescue, kidnap people. But you would rarely find information about military losses. Most times, the losses are grossly underreported. And this is the kind of information that went on for a long time when it comes to what they post on their Facebook or social media or Twitter or even Instagram posts, both of the Nigerian military and the Nigerian government. I think, unfortunately for the Nigerian military, but fortunately for the people who are consuming the information that they post, the inner workings of the military made it possible for people to get alternative information from the military that they would not have wanted us to hear. And what happened was that in the Nigerian military currently, there's a lot of corruption, diversion of funds, nepotism. And because of this, it had led to bad treatment of the soldiers, especially the ones on the ground. And because they became what you were disgruntled is what you want to call it, these soldiers on the ground started to share information on the actual happenings on the ground in Boko Haram areas that they were fighting Boko Haram. When they were disgruntled or when they wanted to plan the mutinies, these soldiers on the ground would send videos of, for example, actual number of people who had died, the fact that there was low morale, there was not enough weapons on the side of the soldiers to fight Boko Haram, the fact that Boko Haram was killing more people than the Nigerian military was offering as information. These soldiers would send the videos to their family members, mostly on Facebook or on Twitter, or even share this as a part of their mutiny. And it was via this kind of disgruntledness that people who were looking for information about Boko Haram but didn't want to rely on the military, this was the ways that we got the alternative information sometimes. So although they tried to do a lot of narrative control and they still do it, we invariably also got alternative information from the military because of this kind of things that was happening in the military. I think the last part that I want to emphasize on is how the Nigerian citizenry use social media themselves and how they not whip as a weapon now, but maybe not manipulation anyways, but the Nigerian military, the Nigerian citizens also have appropriated for themselves the use of hashtag activism. Especially when it comes to Boko Haram, hashtag activism has become a prominent way for the military, first of all, to participate in the conflict landscape, then to pressure the Nigerian government into either paying attention to something or carrying out a specific action. And the first example I would like to talk about when it comes to efficient use of hashtag activism has to do with this example of when the girls were kidnapped in 2014. For months after the kidnap happened, it was like the government was either trying to assume that it never happened or they were just too slow to react. And it was the consistent hashtags, almost 2.3 million people on Twitter talking about this, bring back our girls. And then the intervention of international celebrities and diplomats around the world that kind of pressured the Nigerian government into looking more inwards into how the kidnapping happened, and then started to talk about negotiations on how the girls could be released. So this is one way that the Nigerian citizenry use social media or digital technology to put pressure on the Nigerian government on when it comes to Boko Haram.
Maybe we'll at this point let's see if there's any questions in amongst folks for you at this point. Clearly, that's one. There are clearly some really great threads within in your talk that need to be explored. I love the example you said of just undermining the trust in the government. That's one motivation. Anyone have any questions in the chat for Medinat at this point? all of our reflections are they're brief, but we hope. Let's see.
No, I already saw a question, and that's why I'm laughing.
Okay. Can you address that in very, very briefly?
So this question has to do with why did the Nigerian government ban or block Twitter? And what was the significance of this? What did it mean to me personally? So to answer the first part of the question, I would say that the immediate cause of banning Twitter was because Twitter deleted the tweet of the Nigerian president when he tweeted something that Twitter felt went against their own regulations. But that was just the immediate cause. If you are very conversant with Nigeria's social media landscape, you would know that Twitter especially is the most participative social media app, when it comes to political discourses, especially. Instagram is where all of the entertainment happens, but Twitter is where all of the serious discussion happens. And a lot of criticism of the Nigerian government, a lot of conversations about what the Nigerian government is doing wrong, a lot of pressuring of the Nigerian government when it comes to, for example, bring back our girls, end Boko Haram. Most of them have happened on Twitter. So yes, Twitter was deleted when the president tweeted something that went against Twitter's regulations. And this tweet, when it first happened, actually, it was not even, Twitter didn't take notice until young people in Nigeria started to tag Twitter and report the tweet. So this might have been the immediate cause, but it was long in coming, in the sense that the Nigerian government has a lot of times threatened Twitter and other internet app owners and companies about interference in Nigeria's country issues and stuff like that. And of course, the role that Twitter played in the NSAS movement, especially how Twitter helped directly or indirectly with getting people to know about it, with donations to the NSAS movement and all of that, it was gonna come. It needed something, and I think what prompted it finally was this deleting of the tweet. But it wasn't just one thing that happened, it was a lot of things that led to this. What was the significance? I think for me, the greatest, we used to, when we talk about like Nigerian analysts and all of that, when we talk about, and other African analysts, when we talk about the things that happen in Africa, we always say that countries who can censor social media and all of that, they all make Nigeria to look like such a cool country because it has never happened before in Nigeria. But when this happened, for me, it lifted the threshold, that it removed Nigeria from any, it was scary because it meant that if the government decided to silence dissent, what they want to call dissent, which is actually the voice of the people, then it was possible for the government to do this. And this is scary because it has never happened. We've heard of countries that block internet during elections and then put on internet after. It has never happened in Nigeria. But when Twitter was blocked, this brought back all of the realities. And Nigeria is actually, it's possible that it's going to happen just the way it happens in other countries, that the voices of the people can't be silenced, and that the government, when they want to do something, then they can't do this kind of thing. So
there's one other question in the chat that there's a couple, but we only have time for one more. From Mark Clark, about, with such diversity of languages in Nigeria, is social media manipulation limited primarily to certain languages or many? You touched on Boko Haram's use of language for code, even operationally, tactically. Yep. But I wonder, maybe this is applicable to other country settings too. What about the impact of multiple languages in a country related to social media? And please do so in 2 minutes.
I will try. Well, I think for Nigeria, yes, there are over 500 different languages, but because we have a lingua franca, which is English, and because this is is spoken whether formally or informally, pidgin English, by many people in the country, then the use of social media and the kind of languages that it's permeable on that is much more easier. And so it doesn't change anything. I think it's what I'm going to say. Will, the fact that there's so much diversity of language does not reflect on how many people or how the use of social media is done. The only issue is that there's a level of formal literacy, that is expected for you to be able to handle, for example, the simplest of smartest phones that can give you internet connectivity. And for people who do not have access to this formal literacy, of course, there are a lot of areas in northern Nigeria, for example, that are not literate. Then this category of informally literate people do not get representation on social media. But for everybody who can formally read and write, then they can use this. They are on these platforms. So it doesn't change, in my opinion. It limits the number of people, but it doesn't change how information can be manipulated and kind of people who get access to this kind of manipulated information. Will, you're muted.
Yeah, you have to be unmuted to have a language, right? At least.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And thank you for the questions in the chat. Again, we're capturing them. Next up, we have Frederick Ogenga. Frederick will present our third reflection related to interventions. He's titled it Beyond Maskani, Connecting Online and Offline Realities. Frederick is an expert in media and security studies. He's the CEO of the Peacemaker Core Foundation Kenya and director of the Center for Media Democracy, Peace and Security at Rongo University. Frederick?
Yes, Will, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, I'm actually in some little bit of a dark space. I hope people can see me clearly. If not, I'll just switch off the camera and talk. But then, what's your suggestion, Will? Can you see me clearly?
We can barely see you, but we can hear you. So maybe best to mute the video, block the video. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just block the video. Yeah, I don't want to dwell so much on the technical aspects of social media, because that has well been covered by Katia quite well in the first reflection. But I would want to talk about the general consensus out there in scholarship when it comes to social media, peace building, and conflict, that actually social media plays a double-edged sword. It's either enabler of conflict and also can help mitigate conflict. And we've seen cases where that has been proven, but the degree of consensus, to what extent social media would play positive role than negative role, is still something that is open for examination. So I would like to therefore jump onto two issues that I would want to talk about today, which is the relationship between the virtual and the physical world, like the offline and the online world, and the intersection and the disjunctures that come about when you're talking about violence and conflict online, and how this relates to violence and conflict offline. And this is something we are touching on, very key point in the paper that we wrote. The other thing that I would like to talk about would be the interventions, locally owned interventions, and the aspect that I'm emphasizing on is appraising local voices, and to what extent that then becomes conflicting when these voices are engaged in a program or an intervention that is supported in collaboration with external funders or international foreign partners. So to begin with, I'd like you to understand that this is something that we are doing practically, and therefore I'll be talking about an intervention that is currently ongoing called Maskani. Maskani is a Swahili word for home, and we called it home because we thought about in our core design workshop. In fact, I would like to say that we actually began thinking about interventions offline before we could really shift those interventions online to begin intervening in real space, in real virtual spaces. So it technically means that even as much as we emphasize online interventions and interactions and reality, they are also really fundamentally informed by offline realities that jump into online spaces and make this thing be what it is. So in our design of Maskani, where we had about 70 students from 6 public universities in Western Kenya and 12 faculty members, we decided on what really would be the fundamental problems that polarizes people on the ground. So we were talking about polarization, of course, in relation to Kenyan political landscape and Kenyan elections, because elections in Kenya, like the one that is forthcoming in August, are usually really contentious, and we've witnessed a series of violence from 2002 to 2007, 2013, 2017. Like in Kenya, election is always a recipe for violence. And often when Kenya was also evolving technologically and media-wise, we saw the landscape changing and social media took over. So the violence that was being instigated using vernacular radio and television and newspapers have really shifted into online spaces courtesy of social media. So we are seeing great polarization happening on social media spaces. So we wanted to intervene on those spaces by doing what is called social digital literacy. So this was a form of a digital literacy program that was meant to work with the youth, because the youth are the key users of social media. But again, the youth are the key drivers of conflict, because they are always weaponized every election cycle to cause violence with politicians. So when we sat around offline in a workshop, we agreed upon those things that causes polarization on Kenyan elections, and we saw those things coming up, like politics, ethnic politics. We saw COVID-19 coming in there, tribalism, and what have you. So we decided on the parameters or the thematic areas of online polarization offline. So my question would be then, therefore, that we cannot come up with really interventions that are really designed to work in online spaces without going back to refer to offline spaces as the real flesh and blood spaces where real conflict and violence break. Because we normally say and argue that what happens online is really a reflection of what happens offline. So when we see polarization happening online, then it gives us some early warning on what can possibly happen offline. So interventions should really be those that use also offline spaces to complement online spaces. So with Maskani, we did about close to 1 year intervention after training these young digital peace builders. And we realized a few things. We trained them on the usual algorithms and how social media is designed to emphasize, to amplify negativity through likes and shares and all that, and then which has really well been explored by Katia. But then again, we worked with these young people to go in and act as a peer-to-peer influencers, where they now go unsuspectingly into these spaces to try and influence dialogue. So we train them about positive messaging, we train them about depolarizing, polarizing dialogue, and we also train them about creating change from within as youth. And what we realize is that at some point on those social media spaces, they get carried away and they get fatigued. You know, the longevity and the stamina to continue doing interventions online reaches a point of saturation where they can't go on. So the question is, what else can you do to make sure that that continues happening in that manner, and so on and so forth. So this reminded us of the benefit and the salience of offline spaces, because the suggestions that came about from this youth was that, well, we can complement what you're doing online in offline spaces by trying out some of these ideas that we are sharing with unsuspecting youths that we interact with on a daily basis. So in other words, I'm talking about the role of media today as an everyday culture. I mean, media today has become part and parcel of who we are. You wake up in the morning, brush your teeth. You wake up in the morning, check your text, browse through your social media spaces, and so on and so forth. So media has saturated our everyday life, and we wanted an intervention that can be easily be accommodated in that agenda of everyday life. And the offline spaces provided a refreshing retreat into that reality. So when the digital peace builders are not online, then they are offline, but they are also trying to engage with the same kind of messaging. But then the question would be, therefore, because even after Maskani, we could not be able to address that question. To what extent were we successful? I mean, that brought us again to this difficult question of an M&E compliant digital peace building intervention. To what extent can we measure the level of success? out of the interventions that we had. Of course, we would use the kind of how many messages were posted, how many responses did we get, how many people participated, how many badges did we give to those who are actively participating, and so on and so forth. But even after that, statistically, we were not able to say we are this much successful or that much not successful. And this one now brings us to the question of offline relevance. And this is where it comes. This is how it happens. At the moment now, we are thinking about those post-election hotspot areas where violence always erupts, flesh and blood violence erupt, and we are thinking about going into those spaces to do offline workshops and interventions, that will be sensitizing the people around those spaces, and then giving them at the same time information on how they're supposed to use online social media spaces as a toolbox for peace building when it comes to elections and electoral violence. And you're thinking that if you manage to do that offline, then after the election, possibly, we can be able to assess whether or not we are able to reduce the level of violence, say by 10%, 20%, by 50% in those particular offline spaces. So, for example, if the level of violence this year decreases in Kondele, which is actually the climax of the cradle, rather, of post-election violence in Kenya, then we will be able to say that perhaps we are able to achieve something out of the offline intervention that you had with the youth that always caused violence there, which now transforms and translates itself into online virtual spaces to do similar things. So in other words, the offline environment is a very closed environment in terms of extensity and in terms of the geographical scope. So how about now escalating what happens offline, online, so that you can increase the magnitude of the intervention that you're trying to make in those spaces? So that is what we are experimenting on in order to say that perhaps we have this measure of success that we can talk about. Then again, there's this idea. The second idea is the idea of
Frederick, can you pause there? We might get to. I know you wanted to focus on the local aspects, further on the local aspects, but I wanted to see if there's a couple questions in the chat and a really interesting comment about the youth as instruments, which is probably a broader comment or question. That they weren't looking for an answer, but just a comment. Anyone, please, any points that anyone wanted to raise about the challenges that Frederick has discussed related to the offline and online dynamics. I know that we had there's a clearly one of the questions that comes to mind is how you began to raise this with the local aspect of it, but one question that seems to me is how do we handle the issue of ownership when it comes to local knowledge and capacity for interventions online? You mentioned particularly when things are externally funded. So maybe you want to address that while we look for other questions.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I'm talking practically because you really find that because of the lack of capacity for young NGOs such as the Peacemakers Corps Foundation Kenya, we kind of rely on partnership, and this really touches on what Katia mentioned earlier on the idea of collaboration, a whole society type of approach in terms of how you want to handle these things. And of course, there's really a lot of value that comes out of partnership. But I saw a little bit of a disconnect between how really the foreign partners that want to come and collaborate with you. Of course, they fund the projects. They would also want to connect with the ideas they have and the values they have with something that might be out of touch with what the local cultures are and local agencies are. And of course, when there's that kind of a clash, then it means that collaboration will not go on forward smoothly. So to what extent now do we now strike a balance between this new emphasis on local actors and local voices vis-a-vis the lack of capacity and the idea that projects, most of them in Africa, are funded from external donors and collaborators? That is really a big problem. And I think it's something that requires, another workshop, to come up with solutions. But we realize that, of course, if you ask me, part of what I would do is just to really go on with the idea of local agencies and local voices, giving that priority, irrespective of what really the donors would want to imagine, or even the local, the international collaborators, because as a matter of fact, you understand the environment well, and I think it's important to respect the voice that really understands and masters the environment. And of course, this is not to say that we are really epistemologically speaking looking down upon foreign knowledge. It's a question of really trying to have some kind of a intellectual democracy. In other words, like you want to also make sure that your voice is heard on the negotiating table, because really peace building has become an enterprise, and some people have dominated that area, that space, and as a little local actor, sometimes it becomes very difficult for you to project the ideas that are working in those spaces, so that those ideas can continuously get support. So big and nice ideas end up dying along the way, and big and good collaborations end up collapsing because of the lack of synergy.
Okay, that's
yeah.
One last question, just within just a minute or so. There, something that you've raised in your earlier remarks and first part of your remarks, and we discussed the other day, about how the offline space activities and work and time in the offline space sustains activists in the online space. There was a question just put in the chat for that. I wondered if you could just spend just 1 minute, just responding to that a little bit further.
What's the question, Will?
Well, about how the offline space can sustain work in the online space, that activists have a need for. What do we know about living in the offline space that allows us to continue our work in the online space, even knowing that?
Yeah. Actually, to me, I would say the offline space is actually the genesis. That's where it begins, and many of these ideas, when you're in the virtual world, is like you are in a framework, in a control framework, whereby you kind of like guided with some level of agency that is not found in ecological spaces where the natural world, and I think you often are reminded that you need to get out of here and continue with what is more urgent, which is found in the sensory world, and therefore, because look, if a few things I can mention there is that when you're in a technological world, you're worried about airtime.
Yes, Frederick, I'm going to cut you there because I think your point was well made, and we would love to continue this dialogue in the chat.
Just before you go, Will, I just wanted to strike this point about the expensive nature of the virtual world. The expensive nature of the virtual world it requires that you have bundles, requires that you have internet access, requires that you have all these gadgets. And sometimes these are not really things that are readily accessible and available in rural setups and environment, which are can really be found quite freely in the offline spaces, when people are engaging in their everyday life. So this offline space can complement the virtual space.
Sorry, Frederick. Let's take that up, and we'll take more questions in the chat on that. I'd like to go right to Iria for a final reflection. Iria will address a bit of a way forward, the necessity of a conflict-sensitive approach, the impact of information warfare, and the role of data. She is a senior research fellow at Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, where she works on information warfare, including coordinated propaganda and disinformation. So, Iria, the floor is yours. You're on mute still.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm really glad to share with Katia, Frederick, and Medinav here. I'm going to try to connect what we have been discussing about the challenges, the local interventions, and how the conflicts dynamics operate in the ground with the reflections we had in the discussion paper. And since the time is really short, I'm going to focus in three aspects. I would like to address the increasing impact of information warfare in political conflicts everywhere in the world globally, the need to continue to do conflict sensitivity analysis as a peace building operations and are undertaken, and the growing importance of having the right data to do this analysis. First, regarding the information warfare, we need to be cognizant the social media is impacting conflicts globally in a more direct manner than it used to be. We have been talking about information disorders and disinformation for the last 10, 12 years. But in the last few years, we have seen more operations were clearly connected to armed operations. And that is kind of direct interest for the peace building audience. We saw the use of social media as a weapon on the recent situation in Afghanistan, and we are seeing right now in a full blow in the case of Ukraine. So we need, as a community, the peace building community, to be more clear about the information environment and information operations are not only something surrounding the conflict environment. It's part of the conflict. Is the way is part of the way in conflicts are fought. It's not just the missiles, the tanks. It's also the way propaganda is deployed. Is way how the narratives are used to shade the political decisions, to make the local population fearful, or even to discourage soldiers to fight. So all of these things are happening, and is something we need to understand better, how these information warfares are being dividing, using as a dividers in the societies, how they are increasing the conflictivity, even the violence of the conflicts, and also what can be done to counteract this kind of operation. So how the same way people are monitoring the deployment of troops armament, they should be monitoring how is this conflict dynamics, narratives, information is being deployed to win the war in some contexts, and how that may affect any peace building effort you are undertaking, even in case it is a war, an open war, or in case it is a latent conflict. And that conflict can be exacerbated by the use of information warfare. So thinking this as the major challenge we are facing, the peace building community should be incorporating this link between what is happening in the informational space and what is happening on the ground in their analysis of the conflict. So it's not something additional, it's a variable, a dimension had to be part of any conflict analysis an organization is undertaking when it's trying to mitigate the risk for a war, or when it's trying to promote a peace building force, a peace accord, a negotiation, or any other force of conflict resolutions. We believe the elements of analysis, a real effective conflict analysis, had to consider the divisions that are in the people locally. So what social media does is often amplifying and exacerbating conflicts that are real, exist in the society, and they put it that to the limit. But they rarely invent the dividers. They just use the dividers to further violence among the people. So analyzing what is happening in the society will help to understand how the information warfare is playing in that. Part of this analysis will include how the different actors in a conflict are using social media. In the comments previously, there were people asking, well, is some people using social media for de-escalating conflicts? It's possible to use for consensus. And most of the time, there are kind of small civil society organizations trying to do that. Sometimes there are political actors trying to do that, or researchers or journalists. Part of the analysis had to be finding those local actors trying to do this to keep their strengths in that war. In the same way, we tend to focus on analyzing the harmful content and the actors who are weaponizing the use of social media. So both sides should be part of the conflict analysis. And also we need to understand the differences between the different environments. What kind of apps are the most used? There is a censored space, there is some self-censorship, there are chilling effects, there are issues of access. So all of these aspects are important. So it's very different, a conflict in Europe in which most of the people have access to different information, different sources of information, both online or traditional media, television, or other kind of emphasis, though having a propaganda operation and information operation in a country in which there is no free media, in which all the media is controlled by an authoritarian government, and there's no way to turn on the television and see the news because there's no news there, just propaganda. So the only place for having news in those countries is usually WhatsApp. It's usually Twitter. And see, we cut those because we say, no, this is a lot of disinformation in these channels. You're just leaving a lot of people who have any sort of information. And that is also need to be part of the analysis where people are doing that when they're trying to understand these dynamics. Also, the companies, the social media platforms, the corporation need to be more willing to understand they are part of the equation in those new ways of conflict. These hybrid wars have been playing in several parts of the wars, and they need to incorporate conflict analysis in their operations, and how this can be integrated in the human rights assessment or the risk sweeping routines. It had to be part of the normal operations because they affect the way the conflicts develop, and they had a responsibility maybe an ethical responsibility, but also it can be an economic or political responsibility, or even legal liability in some cases. So they need to start embedding in their social media protocols how to address this kind of situation in which information operations exacerbate conflict, especially in countries where already afflicted by armed conflict, or in countries with the institutions very fragile and not able to provide for citizens' rights. Finally, to do this conflict sensitivity analysis, to be cognizant on the dangers for the information operations in social media, we need data. So that is crucial for any meaningful intervention in social media from the peace building community. We need to get access to data, and this is a challenge at the moment. There is insufficient data, and there is insufficient capabilities for analyzing this data in this particular sector. So these capabilities exist in other industries, but most of the people working in peace building and haven't been training in social media analysis and didn't trust the environment and would prefer not to deal with it. So we need to overcome that barrier. Kind to build some trust and partnerships between the peace building community, researchers in social media and conflicts, and the corporations too. So the corporations can be seen not only as a driver of the problem, but they also are an agent for the solutions, and that won't happen until we start building trust between all the stakeholders who had a say in trying to build peace globally. When we had this kind of open conversation between the different stakeholders, then we can start to define what kind of data is needed for making better decisions about different courses, actions, how to counteract information warfare, and how to build positive narratives, helping to drive consensus, happy to get people together and to solve the conflicts. Of course, we had to be also mindful when we ask for data from the corporation. Always remember the access to data and the use of that data had to be also need to be some safeguard for solving problems, protecting the data of people, so don't put people in risk of being attacked from harmful actors because of the kind of analysis being published. So all these dimensions have to be in consideration when we are building our way forward to solve the issues of conflicts and social media. I guess that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Iria. That's great. Before we we have about 5 minutes left in our session. So I'm happy to turn it over to any questions in the chat. I would just, while people are adding any questions or comments there, I would just note a couple things from your remarks. One, and they link to what Frederick was saying. Interestingly, Frederick made the point of kind of the need for localizing, and I heard in your recommendations for conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity, relying on the local perspective, that people understand the environments in which they're living, in which the conflict is taking place. And then I thought really one of the kind of big themes that came across from what you said was this idea that we still need a cognitive change in a lot of ways before we can have adoption or kind of incorporation. And I'm thinking just even the realization, as you said from the outset, that information warfare is a part of warfare now. It's not an addition. It's not just a tool. It is a key element. And I think we're still, there's in many ways we're still in a traditional way of peace builders, perhaps less so, but many of us in society still with a traditional mindset. I don't know if you have a reaction to those points, but I just thought I'd raise a couple of things that I heard there.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether these are questions or comments from the audience. It would be nice to get more exchange.
Yeah. Anyone else with some reaction to Iria's presentation? You definitely, while we're waiting for that, you made the recommendation as well in terms of dealing with the companies, a recommendation that resonates in the paper we produce, which is that data access is just a key to all of these issues. We can't judge effectiveness. We can't understand the full scope of technologies, and it's essential for us to being able to respond to these challenges.
Yes, but for gaining access to data, we need to be partners with the corporations. So this idea of asking the corporation to give away the data publicly, being transparent, so in the sense of putting all the data out there, is not feasible, but actually can be dangerous. Because you put all the data out there, you may put in people in risk. We had that experience about that. So it's better if we try to start a conversation with these corporations and make them part of the solutions instead of looking at them as enemies. Because we already had a lot of enemies in real world conflicts, so we don't need any more.
Thank you. No, that's a really good point. That it's better to be a partner at the outset rather than just have information data released. Anyone else with any points either on Iria's or Iria's remarks or any final thoughts? We're about to close. Let me just.
Yes, Will. I do have something to say.
Yeah.
I wanted to say really that one way of amplifying offline spaces is to take advantage of the role and value of culture, and by this I would want to emphasize that there is real value in artistic impressions, like people who play music and people, poets, because these are the social influencers outside, even both in offline and online spaces. And that is something also we are beginning to experiment with, where we use artists to capture impressions, poets and musicians. And therefore, these influencers offline could also really be peace champions, where they really emphasize on some of these interventions that you're trying to make online. So they can support and supplement each other.
Yeah, and that's a really good point.
Culture as everyday life. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I know that Mercy Corps, for example, has worked with musicians in Nigeria about misinformation. So there's plenty of direct impact. I think you're talking even more broadly about the role of culture. So let me just close then by thanking all of our presenters, all the participants for your great questions. Hopefully you've input into the forum. I want to thank Adrian, my colleague at Mercy Corps, Ashwarya and Nick of AFP. And just, again, thank you for all of your inputs. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you all very much. And I suppose you can look for the video in a couple of weeks on the Alliance website. Thank you all very much for attending, and we look forward to staying in touch.